"I'll sleep on the floor, I'm tired," native woman whispered. Lonely rancher didn't turn her away. It was a cold evening on the vast ranch. The wind whipped through the empty plains, bringing with it the sharp bite of winter. Jack, the rancher, sat near the fire, his tired eyes staring into the flames. The only sound he could hear was the crackle of the burning wood and the occasional howl of the wind outside. The days had become long and lonely. For years he had worked the land alone, with only the animals for company. He had built the ranch from the ground up, and though he was proud of the life he had made for himself, something always seemed to be missing. The silence at night was deafening, and the emptiness of the house was a reminder that there was no one to share it with. Jack had learned to live with the solitude. He'd convinced himself that he preferred it that way, but deep down he knew he longed for something more. A connection, a companion, someone to share the long days with. However, the harshness of the land and the hard life of a rancher didn't leave much room for relationships, especially in a place so isolated. As the fire crackled and the night stretched on, Jack's thoughts wandered to his past. He remembered the faces of people he had known, the ones who had come and gone, leaving no trace. Some had been kind, others not so much, but none of them had stayed. Jack had always been the one to leave when things got tough. He was used to being alone, and that was the way he liked it, or so he told himself. But that evening, something changed. There was a knock at the door. Jack stood up, surprised. He hadn't been expecting anyone. He wiped his hands on his pants and walked toward the door, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. As he opened the door, a gust of wind blew in, making him shiver. Standing before him was a woman. She was small, but the weariness in her eyes made her seem older than she looked. Her hair was tangled and matted, and her clothes were torn from the journey. Her face was pale from exhaustion, and she seemed as though she could collapse at any moment. She looked up at Jack, her dark eyes searching his face, almost as if she was weighing her next words. "I'll sleep on the floor. I'm tired," she whispered, her voice weak but firm. Jack blinked, unsure if he had heard her right. The words didn't quite make sense, but there was something in her eyes that made him want to help. He stepped aside, his hand outstretched, motioning for her to come in. "You're welcome to stay," he said softly, his voice rough from lack of use. "Come inside, get warm." The woman gave him a small nod of gratitude before she stepped inside, her movements slow and cautious. As she crossed the threshold, she took a deep breath, as if the simple act of entering a warm house had given her a moment of peace. Jack closed the door behind her, and for a moment the two stood there in silence. Tala, as she introduced herself, had been traveling for days. Her people had been scattered, forced from their land by those who wanted to take what wasn't theirs. She had fled, hoping to find a place where she could rest, a place where she would be safe. She hadn't expected to find anything, but she had hoped. Jack listened quietly as she spoke. Her words were soft but filled with a quiet strength that resonated with him. He had heard stories of the native people who had been pushed from their land, their lives destroyed by those who didn't care about their history or their culture. He had heard of the battles they fought, the struggles they faced, but he had never met anyone like her before. Her story was simple, yet heartbreaking. She had lost everything, her family, her home, and her way of life. She had been left to wander, searching for anything that could give her a sense of purpose again. Jack could feel the weight of her journey in her words. She had been on her own for so long, relying only on herself to survive. Jack didn't know what to say, but he knew he couldn't turn her away. She was tired, and he had a bed. It wasn't much, but it was a place to rest. He motioned to the small couch by the fire. Sleep here. You'll be safe for the night, he said, his voice gentle. Tala nodded gratefully and sank into the couch, her body trembling from exhaustion. Jack stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. He wasn't used to having anyone in his home, let alone a stranger. But there was something in her eyes that told him she was in need of more than just shelter. As the night went on, Jack busied himself with the fire, adding more logs to keep it burning bright. He didn't want to disturb her, but he couldn't help but notice how peaceful she looked as she lay there. Her breathing slowed, and soon the only sound in the room was the soft crackling of the fire. Jack sat back in his chair, staring at the flames. He wasn't sure what had drawn him to offer her a place to stay, but something inside him told him it was the right thing to do. He had always kept to himself, always kept his distance from others, but tonight was different. Tonight, he had opened his door to a stranger, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel so alone. The wind howled outside, but inside the cabin there was warmth. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, letting the fire's glow wash over him. Maybe this was the beginning of something new, something he hadn't expected, but something he could no longer ignore. Tomorrow, he would have to figure out what to do next. But for tonight, he was content. Tala was safe, and for the first time in a long time, Jack felt that maybe he wasn't as alone as he had thought. The morning came softly, with the pale light of the sun filtering through the small windows of Jack's cabin. The fire from the night before had burned low, leaving only a faint warmth that clung to the walls. Jack was already up, his boots heavy against the wooden floor as he made his way to the kitchen. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, and the sound of the kettle boiling was the only noise breaking the stillness. Tala stirred on the couch, her movements slow as she woke. She stretched out her arms and let out a quiet yawn. She had slept through the night in a way she hadn't in weeks. The bed, if you could call it that, wasn't much, but the comfort of knowing she was safe for just one night had made a difference. As she sat up, she glanced around the cabin. It was small, rustic, but there was a warmth to it that made it feel welcoming. The walls were covered in old wooden planks, and a few simple pieces of furniture made up the space. There were no luxuries, no frills, just the essentials. Tala rubbed her eyes and stood, stretching her stiff limbs. She was used to traveling, used to being on her feet for hours at a time, but the long journey had taken its toll. Her body ached, and her muscles felt stiff, but the moment she stood up, she could feel her strength slowly returning. Jack looked up as he heard her movements. He had set a pot of coffee on the stove, and the soft aroma filled the room. He turned, his face softening when he saw her. Tala stood near the couch, unsure of what to do next. Jack smiled slightly and motioned to the small table by the window. "Coffee's ready if you'd like some," he said, his voice rough but kind. Tala nodded, her eyes grateful. She had never been one to accept charity, but there was something in Jack's tone that made it feel less like charity and more like simple hospitality. She walked over to the table, her feet quiet on the wooden floor, and sat down, waiting for Jack to pour the coffee. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice still hoarse from the long days of travel. Jack poured 2 cups of coffee, setting one in front of her before sitting across from her at the table. They sat in silence for a moment, both of them drinking the warm liquid, letting the comfort of the morning settle over them. The silence wasn't awkward, though. It was a quiet peace, something they both needed. Finally, Tala broke the silence. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with a quiet curiosity. Jack looked up at her, studying her face. There was a strength in her, despite the weariness that still lingered in her eyes. He knew her story, or at least part of it. the part she had shared the night before. He hadn't pried, and he wasn't about to now. He knew she would share what she wanted when she was ready. "You're at my ranch," Jack said simply. "It's about a day's ride from the nearest town." Tala nodded, taking in the information. A ranch. She had never expected to end up on a ranch, let alone in the home of a stranger. But there was something in Jack's demeanor that made her feel safe. She didn't feel threatened here, even though she was a woman alone in a strange place. His presence was steady, and there was a quiet kindness in him that she hadn't expected. Jack watched her, waiting for her to speak, to share more if she wanted to. He wasn't in a hurry, and he wasn't pushing her. He had learned long ago that sometimes people just needed time, and he understood that better than anyone. Tala shifted in her seat, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "Do you always live like this?" she asked, her voice low. "So far from everything?" Jack paused, his brow furrowing slightly as he thought about her question. It wasn't something he had ever really considered. For him, this was home. He had built this ranch from the ground up, and over the years, it had become his life. It was his world. He had never needed anything more. "I've been out here for a long time," Jack replied, his voice thoughtful. "I like the quiet. I've got everything I need here. The land, the animals, and that's enough for me." Tala studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his face. She could tell there was more to the story, but she didn't press him. People like Jack, she knew, didn't share everything at once. They were guarded, like she was. And it was all right. It didn't make him any less of a person. It made him real. "I understand," she said softly. Jack nodded. They both understood the value of silence, the silence of the land, the silence that let you think, that gave you room to breathe. For Jack, this place had been his refuge. It had kept him safe, hidden from the world that he didn't quite belong to. And for Tala, the quiet had always been the thing she relied on most. She had learned to live without noise, without distractions. She had learned to survive in the silence. Jack sat back in his chair, finishing his coffee in slow sips. The morning sun slowly climbed higher, and the light in the cabin grew warmer, more inviting. He knew it wasn't much, but it was something. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel completely alone. Tala sat quietly, feeling the weight of the moment. She had never been one to ask for help, never been one to trust easily. But something about Jack, something about the quiet kindness in his eyes, made her feel like she could. She wasn't sure what it meant or where it would lead, but for now, she was content. They finished their coffee in silence, each lost in their thoughts. And when the last of the coffee was gone, Jack stood and began preparing the ranch for the day. Tala followed him, her movements slower, but no longer weary. She wasn't sure what the future held, but in that moment, she knew she was safe. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. As the days went by, Jack and Tala settled into an unspoken rhythm. The mornings began with the soft light of dawn creeping through the windows, and the evenings were filled with the sounds of the crackling fire and the wind whispering through the trees outside. The world felt quieter here, more at peace. It was as though time moved slower when you were far from the hustle and bustle of the world. Jack had always been a man of few words, preferring the company of his horses and the quiet of the land to conversation. But with Tala, things felt different. She wasn't like anyone he had ever met before. She had a calm, quiet strength that seemed to fill the space around her. And though she didn't say much, her presence was comforting. She didn't need to fill every silence with words. She simply existed, and that was enough. Tala, on the other hand, had never known a life like this. She had been raised in a world full of noise, voices calling out to her, people rushing from one place to the next. But here on Jack's ranch, there was only the sound of nature, the soft bleating of the sheep, the low neigh of the horses, and the wind. It was peaceful in a way she hadn't known she needed. She spent her days helping Jack with the ranch work. At first it had been difficult. The ranch was much bigger than she had anticipated, and there was more to do than she had expected. But Jack was patient. He taught her how to tend to the horses, how to fix the fences, how to handle the cattle. Each task was a new challenge, but Tala had a natural grace and strength that made her a quick learner. She moved with a quiet confidence that Jack admired. By the end of the first week, she had become more comfortable. She found herself getting up early to help with the feeding of the animals and working alongside Jack as he mended broken fences and made sure the ranch was running smoothly. She enjoyed the hard work. It kept her mind from wandering to darker places, places she didn't want to remember. One afternoon, as they worked side by side to mend a fence near the edge of the ranch, Jack stopped and looked at her. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting the world in a golden light. Tala was kneeling in the dirt, her hands working skillfully as she tightened a bolt on the fence. She didn't notice Jack watching her, lost in the work. "You're good at this," he said, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet but sincere. Tala looked up, surprised by the compliment. She hadn't expected it, but there was something about Jack's tone that made her feel proud. "I'm learning," she said simply, wiping the sweat from her forehead. Jack nodded. "You pick things up quickly." Tala smiled slightly, feeling a sense of warmth in her chest. It was the first time someone had told her that she was good at something in a long time. It wasn't that she craved praise, but it was a reminder that she was capable, that she could do something. The days turned into weeks, and as they passed, Jack began to notice subtle changes in her. She smiled more often, her shoulders no longer so tense, her eyes less guarded. The woman who had arrived on his doorstep, exhausted and weary of the world, was beginning to open up. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Jack spoke up again. "You know, I don't mind the silence," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I've never needed much company, but it's different with you here." Tala glanced at him, her brow furrowing slightly in curiosity. She wasn't sure what he meant, but there was something in his words that made her heart stir. Jack paused as though he was thinking carefully about his next words. "I don't like being alone," he continued, his eyes meeting hers. "But I'm used to it. You get used to it after a while." Tala didn't say anything at first. She wasn't sure what to say. She had heard the words, but they didn't quite make sense. Why was he telling her this now? But Jack wasn't looking for an answer. He was just speaking, letting the words come out in the quiet of the night. "You've been here for a while now," he added. "I don't want you to feel like you have to stay if you don't want to. I know you've got your own life, your own path." Tala looked down at her hands, her fingers playing with the edge of her sleeve. She knew he was trying to offer her an escape, a way out if she needed it. But the truth was, she didn't want to leave. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack didn't respond right away, but when he did, it was with a quiet understanding. "I get that," he said, his tone warm. For the first time since she had arrived at the ranch, Tala felt like she truly belonged somewhere. It wasn't just the work or the quiet of the land. It was Jack's presence. He had never pressured her to do anything, never made her feel like she was a burden. He simply let her be. The next few days were some of the most peaceful Tala had known in a long time. She woke each morning with a sense of purpose, knowing that the ranch needed her and that Jack was depending on her. The work was hard, but it felt good. There was something satisfying about seeing the results of her efforts. The horses fed and groomed, the fences mended, the animals taken care of. One afternoon, as they worked together in the barn, Jack turned to her and gave her a small smile. "You're a good worker, Tala," he said. "Better than most." She didn't respond right away, but the words hung in the air between them. For the first time, Tala felt like she had found something she could be proud of. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. The days continued to pass, and the bond between them grew stronger. They didn't speak of it often, but there was an unspoken understanding that had developed between them. They were no longer two strangers thrown together by circumstance. They were something more. Two people who had found comfort in each other's presence. Tala was beginning to feel something for Jack, though she didn't know how to name it. He was kind, strong, and steady, but most importantly, he had shown her something she hadn't known she needed: trust. She trusted him, and in return, she was learning to trust herself again. One evening, as the two of them sat on the porch, watching the sunset behind the mountains, Jack turned to her and said, "You know, I never thought I'd get used to having someone around." Tala smiled. "I'm not so bad, am I?" Jack chuckled softly. "No, you're not so bad at all." For the first time since she had arrived, Tala felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. The days were growing warmer, and with each passing one, the ranch seemed to come alive in new ways. The fields were turning green again, the horses had their spring coats, and the animals seemed more active after the long winter. There was something refreshing about it all, a sense of renewal in the air. Jack had always loved this time of year. It was the time when the ranch felt like it was full of possibility again. Tala had become more than just a guest on the ranch. She had become a partner in the work. The bond they shared had grown in the silence of the mornings and the shared chores of the afternoons. They spent their days working side by side, mending fences, feeding the animals, and taking care of the land. Jack had noticed that Tala had a natural skill for working with the horses. Her movements were graceful, and the animals responded to her with an ease that impressed him. One morning, Jack found himself watching her as she calmly worked with one of the horses. He had never seen anyone handle the animals with such care and skill. It was as though she had an innate understanding of them, a connection he had never quite experienced himself. There was something in her that made the horses trust her right away, something that came from a deeper place than just skill. It was a quiet confidence, a gentleness that radiated from her and settled into the animals. "You're good with them," Jack said one day, his voice carrying across the barn as he watched her gently calm a nervous horse. Tala looked up at him, offering a small smile. "I've been around horses before," she said simply, but Jack could see the pride in her eyes. "I can tell," he replied, nodding in approval. They had been working together for a few weeks now, and Jack had started to notice how much more comfortable Tala had become. She was still quiet, still reserved, but there was a peace about her now. She no longer looked over her shoulder at every sound. She no longer seemed so lost in her thoughts. Slowly, day by day, she had begun to trust the land and trust herself. But Jack knew that the world outside the ranch wasn't as kind. He had heard the stories, the rumors about what had happened to her people, the violence and loss they had endured. Tala had never spoken of it in detail, but he could see it in her eyes whenever she mentioned the past. There were times when her face would darken, and Jack could feel the weight of those memories pressing down on her. The truth was, he didn't know much about her past, and he didn't push her to share it. He respected her silence, just as he respected the land they lived on. Some things he knew were better left unspoken, and as much as Tala had become a part of his life, he understood that she wasn't ready to share everything with him. She had her own journey, one that was far different from his, and he would never force her to open up before she was ready. But that all changed one afternoon when a group of men arrived at the ranch. Jack had seen them from a distance riding up the long dirt road toward the house. They were on horseback, dressed in rough clothes, their faces hidden by wide-brimmed hats. Jack didn't recognize them, but there was something about their presence that made him uneasy. He had been around enough people in his life to know when something wasn't right. Tala had been working near the barn, brushing down one of the horses, when she noticed the riders as well. Her body tensed the moment she saw them, and she instinctively took a step back, her gaze flicking nervously toward Jack. Jack noticed it immediately, his eyes narrowing. He had known her long enough to see the change in her. There was a wariness in her that hadn't been there before, a fear that hadn't been present when they first met. It was as if the sight of these strangers triggered something deep inside her, something she had been trying to keep buried. The men arrived at the front gate, and Jack walked out to meet them. They were rough-looking, with hard eyes and a swagger in their steps that made it clear they weren't the type to just stop by for a friendly visit. As Jack approached them, one of the men spoke up. "We've heard there's a native woman staying here," the man said, his voice low and challenging. Jack didn't answer right away, his mind working quickly. He had no intention of letting these men intimidate him, but he also knew that the situation could get ugly if he wasn't careful. "She's under my protection," Jack said firmly, his voice carrying across the small space between them. The men looked at each other, exchanging glances. They weren't expecting Jack's response, and it made them hesitate for a moment. Jack could see it in their eyes. They were used to people backing down, to people giving in. But not Jack. He wasn't about to let anyone harm her. One of the men took a step forward, his voice rising. "She doesn't belong here. She should be with her people, not hiding out on some ranch." Tala had come out of the barn by now, standing a few steps behind Jack. Her face was tense, her eyes flicking nervously between the men and Jack. Jack stood tall, not backing down. "I said she's under my protection," Jack repeated, his voice steady. "You're welcome to leave now, or we can settle this another way." For a moment, there was silence. The men studied Jack, trying to gauge whether or not he was serious. They could see the determination in his eyes, and slowly, one by one, they turned and rode off without another word. Tala stood there, her body still tense, watching the men leave. Jack turned to her, his expression softer now. He could see the relief in her eyes, but he also saw something else, the fear, the way her shoulders had sagged as the men left. "You're safe here," Jack said quietly, stepping closer to her. Tala didn't speak right away. She stood there, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. She had wanted to run. She had wanted to hide, to escape, but Jack had stood in front of her protecting her, without hesitation. Finally, after a long pause, Tala spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Jack gave her a small smile, his voice soft. "It's nothing. You're part of this ranch now." And in that moment, something shifted between them. The walls she had built around herself began to crumble, just a little bit. She wasn't used to relying on anyone. She wasn't used to being protected, but Jack had done it without asking for anything in return. And for the first time in a long time, Tala allowed herself to feel the weight of the trust she was beginning to place in him. She wasn't alone anymore. The warmth of the evening sun was slowly fading, the sky painted in soft shades of orange and pink. Jack and Tala sat on the porch of the cabin, both of them quietly watching as the last light of the day disappeared behind the distant hills. The air had cooled, but the feeling of peace that had settled over the ranch was still there. It was a calm that had taken time to grow, a peace that had been earned through hard work and quiet moments shared between the two of them. Over the past few weeks, the ranch had changed. It wasn't just the land that felt different. It was the way Tala had changed since arriving. The quiet woman who had once entered Jack's cabin, weary and afraid, had found a sense of belonging. She had become part of this place, part of its rhythm, its quiet heartbeat. She was no longer the stranger she had once been, and Jack could feel it too. He had never expected to grow attached to anyone, let alone someone who had entered his life so unexpectedly. Yet here she was, not just sharing his space, but becoming someone he relied on. The bond they had formed wasn't one that could be easily explained. There were no grand declarations, no deep promises made between them. It was something that had built itself slowly, with every shared look, every word left unspoken. The way Tala moved through the ranch, her quiet strength that had become part of the land itself, the way Jack had watched her grow into this life, the ranch no longer just a place for him to hide from the world, but a home they had both come to care for. As they sat there on the porch, the night air settling around them, Jack broke the silence. "Do you ever think about where you'll go after this?" His voice was soft, but there was an edge of concern in it. He had learned to respect Tala's space, but the question had been lingering in his mind for days. Tala turned to look at him, her face illuminated by the fading light. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she let the question sit between them, feeling the weight of it. She had thought about it, of course. It was hard not to. She had never been the type to stay in one place for long, but Jack had changed something inside her. For the first time in years, she was beginning to feel like she had a place in the world. "I don't know," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I never thought I would stay here, but things are different now." Jack nodded, understanding the unspoken part of her words. He knew what she meant. They had both come to a point where they couldn't pretend anymore, couldn't ignore the bond that had quietly formed between them. But he also knew that she was still a woman with her own past, her own history, and a journey she had to make, even if it wasn't clear where it would lead. "It's all right if you decide to leave," Jack said gently, "but if you ever need a place, this will always be home." Tala felt a lump form in her throat at his words. She had never expected someone to offer her such comfort, especially not someone like Jack. She had been on her own for so long, used to trusting only herself, that the idea of truly depending on someone else felt strange. But with Jack, there was no pressure. He wasn't asking for anything in return. He wasn't trying to hold her here out of obligation. He simply wanted her to know that she was welcome, that she had a place here if she wanted it. She looked at him, her eyes softening. "Thank you," she said, the words coming out more easily than she expected. "I don't think I could ever leave." Jack smiled, a small, knowing smile. "You don't have to leave. I think you found your place." They sat in companionable silence after that, the kind of silence that only came from understanding. There was no need for more words. Both of them knew what the other meant, even without saying it aloud. The connection they shared was quiet, unspoken, but it was real. As the days turned into weeks, life at the ranch continued in its steady rhythm. Jack and Tala worked side by side, caring for the animals and keeping the land in shape. The ranch had become more than just a place for them to work. It had become their shared home, a space where they were both finding new things in themselves. Tala's confidence had grown even more as she took on new responsibilities around the ranch. She was no longer the uncertain woman who had stumbled onto Jack's doorstep, but a strong, capable person in her own right. She had found peace here, not just in the land, but within herself. Jack had given her the space to heal, the time to figure out what she wanted, and most importantly, he had never asked her to explain herself. For Jack, the changes were just as profound. He had always been content in his quiet, solitary life, but something had shifted in him. He had started to find joy in the small moments, the laughter shared over a simple meal, the quiet companionship that came with a day's work. He had never realized how much he had missed the presence of another person until Tala had entered his life. And now that she was here, he couldn't imagine it any other way. One evening, as they stood side by side watching the sun dip below the horizon, Jack turned to Tala with a serious expression. He had been thinking about this for a while, and it was something he felt needed to be said. "Tala," he began, his voice steady, "I'm glad you're here. I don't think I've ever said it, but I want you to know that. You've made this place better, just by being here." Tala looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his words. She could see the truth in his eyes, and it warmed her heart in a way she hadn't expected. She had come here looking for a place to rest, to escape, but in the process she had found something even more important. She had found someone who cared about her, someone who wanted her to stay, not because she was a burden, but because she had become part of something greater than herself. "I feel the same way," she replied, her voice soft. "This place, this life, it's everything I never knew I needed." And in that moment, as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, Jack and Tala understood that they had both found something they hadn't known they were looking for. A home, yes, but more than that. A family. A bond built not on obligation, but on trust, kindness, and the quiet love that had blossomed between them. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. They stood there together, watching the stars begin to twinkle in the night sky, knowing that whatever the future held, they would face it, side by side.